No one noticed when Emily Carter disappeared, except the man who said she wouldn't last 30 days alone. Daniel Brooks checked his watch at exactly 30 days and smiled, because she was gone, just like he predicted. But 3 years later his company was collapsing under a deal he couldn't afford. The name on every contract was the same E. Carter. He laughed at first coincidence, he said, until the boardroom doors opened and heels echoed across the floor. She didn't look at him, not yet. She just signed her name slowly. And that's when he realized she never disappeared. She was just becoming someone he could never reach again. She said she couldn't survive without him. No explanation, nothing left behind except the version of her they had all agreed upon. The one who couldn't survive. The one who would come back. Except she didn't. Not in 30 days. Not in 3 months. Not ever. Her number went silent. Her social media faded into nothing. Even the people who thought they cared stopped asking after a while, because there was no story left to follow. And Daniel checked his watch on the 30th day anyway, a small satisfied smile forming when there was still no sign of her. As if her absence confirmed everything he had said. As if silence meant failure. But what no one saw, what no one even thought to look for, was that Emily hadn't disappeared at all. She had simply stepped out of a life where she was already invisible, and somewhere far from the people who had defined her limits. She was learning how to exist without their voices, without their expectations, without him. And the quiet she left behind wasn't emptiness. It was space. Space for something else to begin. Something no one was watching. Something no one could measure. Something that didn't need to prove itself right away. Because this time, she wasn't trying to survive the way they expected. She was becoming something they would never recognize until it was too late. No one saw the first night. She almost turned back, standing outside a dimly lit apartment building that smelled faintly of detergent and old carpet. Her suitcase at her feet, her phone cold in her hand. The screen dark because she had already erased the last message she almost sent. She stood there for exactly 40 seconds listening to the distant hum of traffic and the soft flicker of a broken hallway light, telling herself that if she walked back now, everything would return to the way it was, predictable, controlled, small, but familiar. And then she picked up the suitcase and walked inside without looking back. The apartment was barely 600 square feet, with thin walls and a window that faced a brick wall just 10 feet away. The kind of place no one imagined her living in. The kind of place that did not match the version of her Daniel had described to everyone. And for the first time in years there was no one telling her how to arrange the furniture, how to speak, how to exist. Just silence, heavy and unfamiliar. She did not fill it with music or television. She let it stay, learning its shape, its weight, the way it stretched across the hours of the night. She found a job 2 weeks later, not impressive, not the kind that came with recognition or titles, just steady, predictable work that paid enough to keep the lights on and groceries in the refrigerator. She measured everything carefully, dollars, time, energy, every decision deliberate, every mistake hers alone. There were days she felt the edges of doubt pressing in, quiet but persistent, echoing the same words she had heard before. Too weak, too soft, not enough. But this time the voice did not belong to him. And that made all the difference. She started waking up earlier, not because she had to, but because she wanted to reclaim something that had never fully been hers. Mornings became her space. Coffee brewing in a chipped mug, a notebook open on the small kitchen table. Pages filled slowly with plans that no one else would see. Skills she began to teach herself piece by piece. Late nights spent studying, failing, starting again. No applause, no acknowledgement, just repetition, steady and quiet. She did not tell anyone what she was building, not because it was a secret, but because it did not need witnesses yet. Time passed in small increments that no one outside her world noticed. 3 months, 6 months, a year. Her name disappeared from conversations. He barely glanced at. E. Carter Holdings listed as a minority stakeholder in a deal his team had been chasing for months. He skimmed past it with the kind of dismissal reserved for details that did not immediately serve him, because his world had always been large, loud, and fast-moving, and small names did not matter unless they stood in his way. But weeks later the name appeared again, this time not in the margins, but at the center of a negotiation his company could not afford to lose. The room was colder than usual that morning, a long glass table stretching under white lights, the kind of space designed to make people feel smaller than the decisions being made. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks, his confidence practiced, familiar, the same posture that had carried him through years of deals and conversations where he was always the one in control. Until the presentation began and the numbers shifted in a way he did not expect. Projections tightening, leverage slipping, control no longer entirely his. And then the name appeared again on the main screen, larger now, impossible to ignore. E. Carter, lead investor, the letters clean and precise against the sterile background. He frowned slightly, not because he recognized it, but because he did not, and that bothered him more than it should have. Someone across the table spoke about strategy, about restructuring, about the necessity of alignment. But Daniel was no longer fully listening, his attention narrowing to that name. Repeating silently in his mind as if saying it enough times would make it familiar, make it something he could place and therefore control, he leaned back slightly, forcing a small dismissive smile, as if the tension in the room did not apply to him. Coincidence, he thought. Just another investor hiding behind a generic name. Nothing worth disrupting his confidence, and yet something in the room had already shifted. Subtle but undeniable, like a change in pressure before a storm. The doors at the far end of the conference room opened without announcement. Not dramatically, just enough to draw attention without demanding it. A quiet interruption in a space built on controlled expectations. Heels met the polished floor in a steady rhythm. Not rushed, not hesitant. Each step measured, deliberate. And for a moment no one spoke. Not because they were instructed to be silent, but because something about the presence entering the room made noise feel unnecessary. Daniel did not look immediately, not out of indifference, but out of habit, the instinct to maintain control by not reacting too quickly. But when he finally turned, it was not the face that caught him first. It was the posture, the stillness, the kind of quiet confidence that did not seek attention because it already held it. And then recognition did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece, like a memory. Returning in fragments, he could not stop. The way she stood, the way she moved, the absence of hesitation he had once relied on. And when his eyes finally met hers, there was no anger there, no need to prove anything. Just a calm distance that felt more final than any argument they had ever had. She did not greet him, did not acknowledge him in the way he expected. She simply took her place at the table, opened a folder, and signed her name with a steady hand. Emily Carter, clear and unmistakable. And in that moment the silence he once dismissed became something else entirely. Something he could not interrupt, could not control. Because it was no longer the silence of someone who had nothing to say. It was the silence of someone who no longer needed to be heard. No one spoke for a full 3 seconds after she signed her name. And in a room where seconds were usually measured in money, in leverage, in advantage, those 3 seconds stretched longer than anything Daniel had, filling the air again. But the tone had shifted, not dramatically, just enough that Daniel could feel it in the way people glanced toward her before finishing their sentences. In the subtle recalibration of attention that no one acknowledged but everyone followed, he leaned forward slightly, fingers interlaced, the posture of someone regaining control, or at least attempting to, his voice steady when he finally spoke, asking a question about structure, about long-term involvement, the kind of question that should have anchored the conversation back in his domain. But when she answered, her voice calm and measured, there was no edge, no need to assert dominance, just clarity. And that unsettled him more than confrontation ever could have, because there was nothing to push against, no opening to challenge, no weakness to expose. She spoke as if the outcome had already been decided long before this room, long before this moment. And for the first time he realized that whatever had happened in the years she was gone had not been about survival at all. It had been about building something that did not require his recognition to exist. The meeting moved forward, signatures collected, agreements finalized, people standing, shaking hands, the quiet choreography of business concluding as it always did. But Daniel remained seated for a fraction longer than necessary, watching as she gathered her things, every movement efficient, unhurried, untouched by the undercurrent that had begun to pull at him. He expected, perhaps without admitting it to himself, a glance, a word, some acknowledgement that would connect this version of her to the one he had known. Something that would restore a sense of familiarity he could understand, but she did not offer it. She stood, adjusted the sleeve of her jacket, and walked toward the door with the same steady rhythm that had marked her entrance. And just before she reached it, she paused, not turning, not speaking, just a brief stillness that felt deliberate, as if she was allowing the moment to settle exactly as it was, without interference, without explanation. And then she continued forward, leaving the room not as someone who had returned, but as someone who had never needed to come back at all. And Daniel sat there in the quiet that followed, realizing that the silence he once believed meant absence had, in the end, been the space where she became untouchable. Daniel did not follow her out of the room, not because he did not want to, but because something unfamiliar held him in place, a hesitation he could not name, as if stepping after her would mean stepping into a version of reality he no longer controlled. The door closed softly behind her, and the room resumed its normal rhythm, chairs shifting, quiet conversation starting again. But for him, everything felt slightly misaligned, like a picture hung just a fraction off-center. Noticeable only if you stared long enough, and he did, long after the others had moved on, long after the documents had been collected, his attention fixed not on the deal they had just secured, but on the absence she left behind, the same absence he had once dismissed as weakness, now carrying a weight he could not ignore. Later that evening he sat alone in his office, the city stretching out beyond the glass in lines of light and motion, a view that had always reassured him, always reminded him of where he stood in the world. But tonight it felt different, not smaller, not diminished, just quieter, his laptop open in front of him, the name staring back from the screen again. Emily Carter, not hidden in small print this time, not buried in reports, but at the top of a portfolio that connected more pieces than he had realized. Companies, partnerships, investments that intersected with his world in ways that now seemed impossible to ignore. He scrolled slowly, each line revealing a pattern he had never noticed, not because it was hidden, but because he had never thought to look, and that realization unsettled him more than anything else. She had not risen suddenly, not appeared out of nowhere with a dramatic return. She had been there, building quietly, deliberately, step by step, while he had been looking elsewhere. Convinced that visibility was the same as power, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, the memory of her voice in the meeting replaying in his mind. Not louder, not sharper, just certain, and that certainty echoed now in the silence of his office. He thought about the last time he had seen her before she left, the way he had spoken with absolute confidence about what she could and could not do, how easily he had reduced her future to a timeline he believed he understood. 30 days. He had said it like a fact, like something measurable, something predictable, and for the first time he questioned not her ability, but his own certainty, because everything about the woman he saw today contradicted the version he had been so sure of. His phone buzzed lightly on the desk, a message from a colleague congratulating him on the deal, another asking about next steps, the usual flow of validation and expectation, but he did not respond immediately. His attention still caught somewhere between the past he had constructed and the present he could no longer define. Outside, the city continued moving, unaware of the shift that had just taken place in a single room, unaware that a narrative he had relied on for years had quietly unraveled without confrontation, without announcement, without needing his acknowledgement. And as he finally closed the laptop, the reflection in the dark screen showed a man who had not lost anything tangible, not his position, not his influence, not his success. And yet something had changed, something subtle but irreversible. Because for the first time he understood that she had never needed to prove him wrong. She had simply moved beyond a world where his judgment mattered at all. The next morning arrived without announcement. Just a slow wash of pale light across the city, the kind of quiet beginning that carried no urgency, no expectation. And yet for Daniel it felt heavier than the day before, as if something unseen had shifted the balance of everything he thought he understood. He moved through his routine with practiced precision, coffee poured, tie adjusted, schedule reviewed down to the minute. But there was a subtle interruption in his focus, a pause between actions that had never been there before, a moment where his mind drifted back to a name, to a presence, to a silence that had not asked for his attention and yet had taken it completely, across the city, in a space far removed from glass towers and polished conference rooms. Emily Carter stood by a window that looked out over a quieter street. Sunlight touching the edge of her desk, papers arranged with deliberate care, nothing excessive, nothing designed to impress, just clarity, just function, the kind of environment that reflected decisions made without needing validation. She reviewed a document with the same steady focus she had carried into the boardroom, not because the stakes were higher, but because consistency had become her foundation. Every detail mattered, not for recognition, but for alignment with something she had built from the ground up, a system of choices that no longer depended on anyone else's approval. Her phone rested nearby, silent, not ignored, simply not commanding her attention the way it once might have. The world outside her work moved at its own pace, notifications, conversations, expectations, all continuing without her needing to respond immediately, because urgency was no longer something imposed on her. It was something she defined. Later that day her name appeared again, not in a room filled with tension, but in an email thread, in a decision that redirected a project, in a quiet approval that carried more weight than any public announcement. And yet she remained exactly where she was, no shift in posture, no change in expression, because the impact of her presence was no longer tied to where she stood physically. It existed in the structure she had created, in the way her decisions moved through systems without needing her to explain them. Back in his office, Daniel noticed the pattern again, the same name intersecting with his work in ways that no longer felt coincidental, each instance small on its own, but together forming something undeniable. He leaned forward, scanning through reports with a focus that bordered on urgency, not because he was losing control, but because he was realizing control had never been as absolute as he believed. The connections were there, subtle but precise, investments placed at the right moments, partnerships formed without noise, influence built without announcement, and the more he looked, the clearer it became that what he had dismissed as absence had actually been strategy, not reactive, not emotional, but intentional in a way he had not anticipated. He sat back slowly, the realization settling in without resistance. Because there was nothing left to challenge, no argument to dismantle, no narrative to correct, only a truth that existed independent of his perspective, and somewhere across the city, without any awareness of his thoughts, without any need to respond to his realization, Emily continued working, the same steady rhythm, the same quiet focus, because whatever she had become was no longer connected to what he understood, and the silence that once made her invisible had become the very thing that made her untouchable. It was not a single moment that changed everything, not a dramatic collapse or a sudden loss, but a series of small realizations that began to settle into Daniel's routine like quiet interruptions he could not ignore, each one subtle on its own, almost easy to dismiss, but together forming a pattern that refused to stay in the background. He began to notice how often her name appeared now, not loudly, not in headlines or public announcements, but in places that mattered more, in approvals that redirected outcomes, in partnerships that quietly reshaped entire strategies. And the more he looked, the clearer it became that she was no longer adjacent to his world. She was embedded within it, not as a participant, but as a force that did not need to introduce itself. One afternoon he found himself reviewing a proposal that should have been routine, the kind he would normally delegate without a second thought, but something in the structure held his attention, a precision in the timing, a balance in the negotiation that felt intentional beyond coincidence. And there it was again, her name, not highlighted, not emphasized, simply present, as if it had always belonged there. He leaned back slowly, fingers resting against the edge of his desk, the city moving outside his window in its usual rhythm, unaware that inside that office something was shifting in a way he could not quantify. He thought back to the version of her he had known, the one who waited, who adjusted, who aligned herself with his direction without question, and the contrast was not just visible now. It was undeniable, because the woman shaping these decisions did not move in response to anyone. She moved with intention that originated entirely from herself. Later that evening, in a quieter moment when the office had emptied and the hum of activity had faded into the background, he opened a file he had overlooked before, not because it was hidden, but because it had not seemed relevant at the time. Now it felt necessary, each page revealing layers he had never considered, timelines that stretched back further than he expected, decisions made in spaces he had never thought to examine. And for the first time he understood that what he had perceived as absence had been presence in a form he did not recognize, not visible, not announced, but consistent, deliberate, and patient. Across the city, Emily stood in a different kind of silence, one that was no longer unfamiliar, one that no longer carried weight, but clarity. She reviewed a new set of plans, her focus steady, her movements precise, not driven by urgency, but by alignment with something she had built over time. There was no rush in her actions, no need to accelerate for anyone else's expectations, because time, for her, was no longer something to keep up with. It was something she directed. Her phone lit up briefly with a message confirming a decision already anticipated. She glanced at it, acknowledged it, and continued. No pause, no shift, because the outcome had already been set in motion long before that notification arrived. And somewhere between those two spaces, between the office where Daniel searched for understanding and the quiet room where Emily continued forward without looking back, a distance had formed that could not be measured in miles or time, but in perspective, in the difference between someone who was trying to catch up to a story already written and someone who had moved beyond the need to explain it at all by the end of the week. Daniel stopped pretending it was coincidence. The pattern had become too precise, too intentional to ignore. Every major shift in the projects he touched seemed to trace back to the same quiet origin. Not disruptive, not aggressive, but undeniably present, like a current beneath the surface that redirected everything without ever breaking through. He began asking questions, not openly at first, but in controlled, measured ways, requesting additional reports, revisiting past deals, following threads he would have once dismissed as irrelevant. And each time the result was the same. Her influence was there, not announced, not credited in ways that drew attention, but embedded in decisions that shaped outcomes before anyone realized they had changed. It unsettled him in a way he could not articulate, not because she had succeeded, but because of how she had done it, without needing the visibility he had always relied on, without the validation he had always assumed was necessary. One afternoon he stood by the window of his office, the glass cool against his fingertips, watching the movement of the city below, trying to reconcile the version of control he had built his life around with the reality unfolding in front of him. He had always believed that power required presence, that to lead meant to be seen, to be heard, to occupy space in a way that left no doubt. But she had done the opposite. She had stepped back, reduced her visibility, and in doing so, expanded her reach in ways he had never considered. Across the city, Emily moved through her day with the same quiet precision. A meeting concluded not with raised voices or prolonged negotiations, but with a simple exchange of understanding. Her role never overstated, her presence never forced, because she no longer needed to convince anyone of anything. The results spoke before she did, and often without her needing to speak at all. She paused briefly at her desk, reviewing a final detail before approving it, her reflection faintly visible in the glass of the window beside her, not as a reminder of who she had been, but as a confirmation of who she had become, someone whose decisions no longer echoed with doubt, someone whose silence no longer carried uncertainty. Back in his office, Daniel opened a message he had been avoiding, a formal update confirming a restructuring that placed her firm in a position he could not overlook. The language was neutral, professional, stripped of emotion, but the implication was clear. She was not just part of the system anymore. She was shaping it. He read the message twice, not because he did not understand it, but because he needed to feel the weight of it settle, needed to let it replace the assumptions he had carried for so long. His phone buzzed again. Another notification, another reminder of the world continuing as it always had, but now every piece of it felt slightly altered, not because it had changed, but because he was finally seeing what had been there all along, and somewhere beyond his line of sight, beyond his need to understand. Emily continued forward without pause, without looking back, because the space she once occupied in his world had long since been replaced by something he could no longer reach, something that did not require his acknowledgement to exist, something that had grown quietly, steadily, until it no longer needed to be explained at all. The shift did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, the way everything else had, not in a headline or a dramatic confrontation, but in a decision that forced Daniel to sit still longer than he was used to. The kind of stillness that left no room for distraction. The proposal in front of him was simple on the surface. A restructuring that would determine the direction of his company for the next 5 years. The numbers were clear, the strategy precise, and the final approval rested not with him alone, but with a controlling interest he no longer held. His fingers hovered over the document, not because he did not understand it, but because he understood it too well. Every line pointed back to the same source, the same quiet presence that had been moving through his world without resistance, without interruption. Emily Carter, her name no longer subtle, no longer tucked into the edges of decisions, but central, undeniable. And yet even now, there was no announcement attached to it, no declaration of power, just the steady reality of what had already been built. He leaned back slowly, the leather chair creaking softly beneath him, his reflection faint in the darkened screen across the desk, and for the first time, he allowed himself to consider not what she had done, but how long it must have taken, how many moments had passed unnoticed while he was certain of her absence, how many decisions had been made in silence while he spoke with confidence about a future he believed he controlled. Across the city, Emily stood in a conference space that did not carry the same weight of tension, not because the stakes were lower, but because the outcome had already been aligned long before anyone entered the room. She listened more than she spoke, her attention steady, her presence calm, not demanding recognition, not seeking approval, because both had already been replaced by something more enduring, something rooted in consistency rather than perception. A colleague asked for her input, and when she responded, it was not to dominate the conversation, but to clarify it. Her words measured, precise, each one placed exactly where it needed to be, and then she stepped back again, allowing the room to move forward without her needing to guide every step. Because control, for her, no longer required constant assertion. It existed in the structure she had built. Back in his office, Daniel closed the document without signing it, not out of refusal, but out of recognition that the decision was no longer entirely his to make. His phone buzzed with incoming messages, requests for direction, expectations waiting to be fulfilled, but for a moment, he did nothing, his attention fixed on a realization that settled without resistance. She had never needed to confront him, never needed to prove anything in the ways he would have understood. She had simply moved beyond the reach of his expectations, and in doing so, had reshaped the very space he operated within. The silence he once associated with weakness had become something else entirely, something that did not ask for permission, did not require acknowledgement, something that had grown steadily until it could no longer be ignored. And as he finally reached for the pen again, the weight of that understanding remained, not as regret, not as loss, but as a quiet certainty that the story he had believed in for so long no longer belonged to him, because it had never been his to define. In the first place, the pen did not feel heavier in his hand, but the decision behind it did. Daniel stared at the signature line longer than necessary, not because he was unsure of the outcome, but because he understood what it represented now. Not a loss, not a defeat, but a shift he could no longer reverse. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that followed after everything important had already been said somewhere else, somewhere he had not been present. He signed his name slowly, the motion deliberate, controlled, the same way he had signed countless agreements before, but this time there was no sense of ownership attached to it, only acknowledgement. Across the city, Emily stepped out of a building into the late afternoon light, the air carrying the soft warmth of a day winding down, her pace unhurried, not because there was nothing left to do, but because she no longer moved in response to pressure. She moved with intention, the sidewalk beneath her steady, the city around her continuing in its usual rhythm. Unaware of the quiet culmination that had just taken place, her phone remained silent in her hand. No urgent messages, no need for immediate confirmation, because everything that mattered had already been set in motion long before this moment arrived. Back in his office, Daniel placed the pen down and leaned back, his eyes moving to the skyline beyond the glass. The same view that had once reinforced his sense of control, now offering something different, not diminished, not changed, but clearer, as if a layer of assumption had been removed, allowing him to see the structure beneath it. He thought about the timeline he had once believed in, the certainty with which he had defined her limits, the ease with which he had reduced her future to something predictable, and how none of it had required correction. None of it had been challenged directly. It had simply been left behind, replaced by something he had not been paying attention to. Later that evening, in a quiet space removed from both offices and expectations, Emily sat with a document open in front of her, reviewing the final details not out of necessity, but out of habit, the kind of habit built over time, grounded in consistency rather than urgency, her reflection faintly visible in the glass beside her, not as a reminder of who she had been, but as a confirmation of the distance she had created from that version, not through confrontation, not through proving anything to anyone, but through a series of choices made quietly, steadily, without needing acknowledgement. She closed the folder gently, her movements precise, her expression unchanged, because there was no moment of victory to claim. No need to mark the transition from one version of her life to another. It had already happened, gradually, in ways no one had noticed until it was complete, and somewhere across the city, Daniel remained in his office longer than usual, not working, not responding to the steady flow of messages waiting for him, but sitting in a stillness that no longer felt like control, and not quite like loss, something in between, something unfamiliar, because for the first time he understood that what he had witnessed was not her return, not a reappearance into a world he recognized, but the quiet confirmation that she had built something entirely outside of it, something that did not need to confront him to surpass him, something that had grown in silence until it no longer needed to be seen to be undeniable. There was no announcement the next day, no message marking what had already shifted, just the continuation of a world that did not pause to acknowledge quiet transformations. Daniel arrived at his office at the same time as always, the elevator doors opening to the familiar floor, the same polished surfaces, the same measured greetings from people who still saw him exactly as they had the day before, and for a moment it almost felt unchanged, almost, until he stepped inside and noticed how everything now carried a different weight, not heavier, not diminished, just clearer, as if the illusion of control he once relied on had been replaced by something more precise, more honest. He moved through his morning with the same discipline, reviewing updates, responding to messages, making decisions that still required his authority, and yet beneath each action there was an awareness he could not ignore, a recognition that influence did not always align with visibility, that the structures he operated within had layers he had not considered before. Across the city, Emily's day unfolded without disruption, a sequence of decisions made with the same quiet consistency that had carried her this far. She entered a meeting not to lead it, but to observe, her presence noted without being announced, her role understood without needing explanation. When she spoke it was brief, precise, enough to shift direction without drawing attention to the shift itself, and then she stepped back again, allowing the process to continue without her needing to dominate it, because what she had built no longer required constant reinforcement. It sustained itself through alignment, rather than force. Later that afternoon, Daniel received a report that summarized the restructuring he had signed the day before. The language was final now, no longer a proposal, no longer open to interpretation, and as he read through it, he saw the full scope of what had been set in motion, not just a change in ownership, but a recalibration of influence, a redistribution of control that extended beyond a single deal, his name still present, still relevant, but no longer central in the way it once had been. He closed the document slowly, not out of resistance, but out of understanding, because there was nothing left to question, no hidden detail waiting to be uncovered, only the realization that what he had once dismissed had been evolving beyond his awareness the entire time. He stood and walked to the window, the city stretching out beneath him, unchanged in appearance, yet different in meaning. The movement below continuing without interruption, people walking, cars passing, decisions being made in countless spaces he could not see, and somewhere within that vast, quiet network, her presence existed without needing to be visible, without needing to be confirmed, because it had already been established, and for the first time, he did not try to trace it, did not try to map it or understand its full extent. He simply stood there, recognizing that some things did not require his comprehension to exist, that some outcomes were not meant to be controlled. And across the city, Emily finished her day without ceremony, gathering her things with the same measured calm, stepping out into the evening light without looking back, not because she was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left behind that belonged to her anymore. And as the door closed behind her, the quiet that followed was not absence, not emptiness, but completion, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that simply is the distance. Between them was no longer measured in time, not in the years since she had left or the moments since she had returned. It existed in something far less visible, in the space between who he believed she was and who she had quietly become. Daniel stopped searching for explanations because every answer led back to the same realization. There had never been a moment where she changed all at once. No single event he could point to and say that was when everything shifted. It had happened gradually. Beneath his attention, beneath his certainty, built from decisions too small to notice until they were too large to ignore, he found himself revisiting memories not for clarity, but for contrast. The way she used to pause before speaking, the way she used to measure her words against his reactions, the way she once occupied space as if it could be taken from her at any moment. And now, that version felt distant, not erased, but irrelevant, because it no longer connected to anything real. Across the city, Emily moved through another day that looked, from the outside, entirely ordinary. A meeting here, a review there, conversations that did not carry the weight of confrontation, decisions that did not require reinforcement. And yet within those ordinary moments existed something far more significant, a consistency that no longer wavered, a presence that did not fluctuate based on who was watching or who was not. She no longer adjusted herself to fit the room. The room adjusted around the clarity she brought into it, not because she demanded it, but because it aligned naturally with what she had built. Later that afternoon she paused briefly, standing by a window as the light shifted into evening, the city reflecting back in softened tones, not as a place she needed to conquer or prove herself within, but as an environment she now moved through on her own terms, her reflection faint in the glass, steady, composed, not searching for validation, not carrying the weight of expectation, just present, fully, and without negotiation. Back in his office, Daniel closed another report, not because he had finished reviewing it, but because he no longer needed to. The patterns were clear now, the structure undeniable, and for the first time he did not feel the need to intervene, did not feel compelled to regain something that had already shifted beyond his reach. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, not in frustration, not in defeat, but in acceptance of a truth that had taken shape without his permission. She had not taken anything from him, had not disrupted his world in the way he would have recognized. She had simply built something outside of it, something that operated on a different foundation, one that did not rely on proximity to him or acknowledgement from him to exist. And that realization settled quietly, without resistance, because there was nothing left to argue against. No version of the past that could redefine what stood in front of him now. And somewhere beyond his line of sight, beyond his need to understand, Emily turned away from the window and continued forward, not toward anything she needed to prove, not toward anyone she needed to confront, but into a life that had already been claimed, already been built, already been lived. Long before anyone thought to look for her again.